It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Elisabeth Weber to the Derrida Today Conference as one of our keynote speakers. Her current research focuses on the ways in which literature and critical theory can contribute to an exploration of trauma, of human rights and their violations, and to a reflection on concepts whose definitions have become, in the contemporary context, more and more uncertain, including the concepts of the human, democracy, justice and rights. And what I think is really interesting about her work is the way in which these issues are brought to light through, but also bear on Jacques Derrida's work. For instance, she's edited Living Together, Jacques Derrida's Communities of Violence and Peace, which contains an essay by Derrida, as well as Guylaine Ajar, among other illustrious scholars. And among many other books, she is the author of Speaking About Torture, Kill Boxers, Facing the Legacy of US-Sponsored Torture, Indefinite Detention and Drone Warfare. She is the editor of several works by Derrida and German translator of texts by Derrida, Emmanuel Levinas and Felix Guattari. And on top of all of this, as well as the prizes she has won for her work, she seems to be an activist. So, for example, in 2019, she was one of the initiators of the statement by humanists and social scientists in support of global youth uprising for climate action. I know we all are looking forward to her keynote today entitled Conjuring Green, Jacques Derrida's Plants. Welcome, Professor Elisabeth Weber.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for a lovely conference. And thank you all for staying so late. So I appreciate that very much. So my title, as Nicole said, is Conjuring Green, Jacques Derrida's Plants. Towards the end of his text, un ver à soie, a silkworm, in French phonetically identical with a worm of one's own, and thus translated as a silkworm of one's own, Jacques Derrida shares an autobiographical memory. He describes how, as a child, before reaching the age of 13, thus before becoming bar mitzvah, during the sun-drenched summers of his native city of El Biar in Algeria, he kept and fed silkworms every day. But I would have liked to make myself the indefatigable officiant of this service. Several times a day, the same liturgy. You had to offer them mulberry leaves, these little indifferent idols. For weeks, I would leave the room where the box was kept only to look for mulberry trees. These trips were journeys and adventure. We didn't know where to look for them anymore or whether we were going to find any more. For the same daily liturgy, the child had to venture out and find a mulberry tree to harvest the only nourishment on which silkworms can thrive. He yearned to be the indefatigable officiant of this service rather than only the necessary few times a day. In other words, the leaves could not be harvested ahead of time. They had to be fresh, brimming with moisture, verdant. Looking back, Derrida describes those 4 to 5 weeks of the silkworm's development towards the insect's last metamorphosis as the time of infinite apprenticeship, during which he confected his own philosophy of nature. So that's the first quote now. And I read the French and you can read the English. Son bestiaire commençait. Cette philosophie de la nature était pour lui, pour l'enfant que j'étais, mais que je reste encore, la naïveté même, sans doute, mais aussi le temps de l'apprentissage infini. La culture de confection, la culture confectionnée selon la fiction, l'autobiographie du leurre, Dichtung und Wahrheit. Un roman de formation, un roman de la sériciculture qu'il commençait à écrire en vue de se l'adresser à lui-même, de s'y dresser lui-même dans un sabbat de couleurs et de mots. Le mot mûrier n'était jamais loin de mûrir et de mourir en lui. Le vers du mûrier dont il conjurait la couleur, comme tout le monde dans la famille, toute une histoire et toute une guerre des religions, Il le cultivait comme un langage, un phonème, un mot, un verbe, vers lui-même, et verdure, et verdir, et vers, et vers, et vers, et verge, et vérité, vérace ou véridique, pervers et vertu, tous les morceaux grouillants de mots en vers, en plus grand nombre encore qu'il célébra plus tard. The English translation of the phrase in this passage on which I want to focus here encapsulates the challenge of translating Derrida's work. Indeed, the French conjurer means to ward off, but it also means to conjure, as in to cause a spirit or ghost to appear by means of a magic ritual, to implore, and also literally to swear together, or to use a figure, a wish, a promise, frequently encountered in Derrida's writing, to bind oneself to another in oath. Conjurer, thus, captures in a particular Derridian way what is at stake, here as well as in many of Derrida's engagements. The promise, the oath, the threat, the ghost, they are all there in the vers conjuré, the summoned, implored, warded off, sworn with, green. Derrida's writing thinking turns around le vers, or as he actually corrects himself, vers lui-même, green itself. The green of the mulberry tree, green itself, an astonishing formulation, is described as that which was cultivated like a language, a phoneme, a word, a verb to be celebrated later. Au commencement, il y eut le vers. In the beginning, there was the worm, or homophonous in French, in the beginning, there was green. And the verse and the verb, green, vert itself, and greenery, verdure, going green, verdir, warm, vert, verse, vert, and I mean, you have read it. Derrida concludes, just now I have found the most beautiful of them, which was looking for me from the start, veraison. Veraison, from verir, varire, to vary, change color, is the moment of ripening, the moment of maturation. Fruits, especially fruits of the vine, begin then to take on the color they will have when they reach maturity. The berry starts to grow again, the grape becomes translucent in white vines, red in black vines. Veraison, the onset of ripening, as a Californian winemaker translates the term, emphasizing the processual and transitional quality whose starting and ending instants are elusive, also indicates the onset of a process of whose end the child raising silkworms is well aware. Le mot mûrier n'était jamais loin de mûrir et de mourir en lui. Phonetically, mûrir and mourir, ripening and dying, are very close to each other. It is this materiality of the signifier and the imperceptible transition from one to the other that the child picks up and which will inform his bestiary, his herbiary, his natural philosophy, and his philosophy tout court. As the mutation of vert, green, into verse, vérité, vert, warm, vert, glass, etc., abundantly shows, to quote one of Derrida's texts on Paul Celan, the idiom remains irreducible. This invincible singularity of the verbal body already introduces us to the enigma of testimony, next to the irreplaceability of the singular witness, which is exactly, perhaps, what this passage is speaking to us about. But veraison, as onset of ripening, is just one of many beginnings. The process of veraison, followed by maturation, is preceded by others, in particular one in which the color green is not a homophonous chance. The botanical reflections offered in the silkworm text, and as I will show in others, especially glas, could be supplemented by another word with which Derrida could also have fallen in love. Viriditas, viridité, Grünkraft, greening power, strength or force, greening, greenness, the greening force with which the German mystic Hildegard von Bingen understood as the living soul of creation. As a philosopher of plants, Michael Marder has recently and vibrantly shown in his book, Green Mass. As Marder writes, in the marvelous proliferation of open vegetal surfaces, viriditas suspends the end as a point of abrupt termination and as a goal to be accomplished by resorting to this or that means. Neither ending nor unending, it is inexhaustible in a manner totally distinct from the myth of eternal presence. Crucially, for Hildegard, viriditas is not limited to plants, which makes of the abbess a plant humanist avant la lettre. In a rigorously non-allegorical, non-symbolic sense, we humans are plants for Hildegard. Together, we partake of the greening greenness that is undeniably more obvious and sensuously present in actual vegetation. Viriditas is the energy of creation and of recreation. The green essence it names is to be heard not only as an adjective that describes a real quality of things, such as a color, but also as a verb that denotes the active making green, a greening of the world in the course of its becoming world. Unreservedly subverting the traditional chain of beings that places the human as master at the top, Hildegard, and with her Michael Marder, appraise the incarnation of viriditas in human animals as considerably less perfect than it is in plants, its perceptible chlorophyllic facets missing from human existence. We are plants and we are the others of plants. In addition to a lacuna of sensuously manifest greenness in human carnality, our enactment of viriditas sets it against itself, contributing to the global spread of aridity and causing everything fresh to wither as we interfere with the self-refreshing capacities of life. Had he encountered the term, Derrida would almost certainly have varied viridité into veridité, greening truth or truing green, and no doubt would have insisted on its proximity to virilité, elaborating on how the power of greening, brandishing as it might be its masculine phallic dehiscence, is so only at first sight, and only if one actually wards off its green. The neologism virginité, virginity, with an E, which appears twice in glas, might capture what is at stake. For viridité pushes la vérité, virginité, virilité to grow in all directions, adding on branches, lianas, leaves, flowers, and does so in lines, curves, turns, and circumventions. Even though Derrida doesn't seem to have encountered the word viridité, greening power, the word closest to it in his writing is physis, which he leaves in Greek. It is, in fact, vigorously at work in the deconstructions of virility, virginity, and verité that occur in his convoluted, that is, intricately folded, twisted, and coiled herbarium, verbarium, to use Claudette Sartilius' fortuitous expression, namely the 1974 maze of a text of which Derrida said it was not a book, glas. The two columns of glas, each in turn divided by a series of inserts, tattoos, incrustations, reflect a composition that deliberately breaks with the linear model of discourse. As Derrida wrote already in 1967 in De la Grammatologie, what is thought today cannot be written according to the line and the book. Viridité, in any case, does not fit between the beginning and the end of a book, as we will also see with glas. Before approaching the plants in glas and other texts, let me, however, address what is alluded to in the conjured green, vert conjuré, in the sense of warded off. To repeat, this is not the only meaning of conjuré, but it is a crucial one. Geoffrey Bennington's choice of this translation is reminiscent of the rhetorical question asked in glas. N'est-ce pas toujours un élément exclu du système, le vomi du système, qui assure l'espace de possibilité du système? Isn't there always an element excluded from the system's vomit, that assures the system's space of possibility? Question mark. In the sentence in question, the motivation for conjuring is only mentioned en passant. The green of the mulberry, whose green color he warded off, conjuré, like everyone in the family, a whole history and a whole war of religions, toute une histoire et toute une guerre des religions. The whole history and the whole war of religions alluded to the centuries-long association of the color green with Muhammad's family, and in the larger sense, the community of Islam, where it is frequently found in Islamic religious flags, including those of jihadist groups, and the state flags of Muslim countries. As Juan Campo notes, Islamic mystics have reflected on the emanation of God's light in the color green as a metaphor for the resurrection. Just as the green growth of living vegetation comes out of the dry earth, and as humanity was originally formed as from the earth, so the body will grow from the earth again at the resurrection. As Surah 71 of the Quran reads. Surah 18 promises as reward to the faithful the gardens of eternity with rivers flowing under their feet. They will be adorned with bracelets of gold and wear green garments of fine silk and rich brocade. Surah 76 describes those who persevere in Muslim faith as being given radiance and joy. Nadratan wa surura. Nadra, radiance, also means freshness, brightness, wealth, bloom, succulency, its roots being the same as for the words for vividness and flourishing. Perhaps a possible Arabic translation of viriditas. And the same surah proclaims again that the virtuous will be dressed in garments of fine green silk and rich brocade, this time adorned with bracelets of silver, and their Lord will give them a purifying drink. Notice the association in these verses of the color green with silk. And Verassois could have embarked on green itself in a whole different direction had green not been warded off. In Muslim culture, the color green thus has strong theological significations. In Islam's theory of color, green is understood as color of the middle between the extremes of black and white, just as Muslims are called in the Quran the community of the middle. That is, the Quran understands Islam to connect in a new synthesis the best of Judaism and Christianity. faithfulness towards the law, and the commandment of love. Geography plays an important role in such a centrality of green as well. On the Arabian Peninsula, where Islam originated, lush vegetation, verdant green, and shadow-offering palms are a rarity. The green of an oasis in the midst of the desert therefore becomes the earthly model for life in the Garden of Paradise. In a landscape where the sun is unforgiving and potentially lethal, the garden's description promises protection from burning heat and deadly dehydration. The faithful who have entered paradise are described as never seeing scorching heat or bitter cold. The garden's shade will be right above them, and its fruit will be made very easy to reach. In more than a dozen verses, the Quran describes paradise as a garden underneath which run rivers. As Nasser Rabat notes, the supreme luxury for a dweller of the desert. Therefore, far from being an untouched or an agricultural space, the garden is a result of the conquest of water by Arab Muslim engineering and hydraulics. It is intrinsically urban, something that the garments worn by its dwellers, silk and brocade, also vividly show. Fouad Awada and Pierre-Marie Tricot find in the Prophet's biography another motivation for a preference of the city. Deeply marked by Muhammad's experience as an orphan, the new religion of Islam combats the tribal values founded on the solidarity of blood in order to replace them with the profoundly pro-urban values of a nation united by the same ideals. The color green, then, stands not for the paradise of some ideal nature, but for its imagination in a decidedly urban space. A popular story about the Prophet related by Nasser Rabat confirms this. Traveling in Syria, the still adolescent Muhammad refused to enter the verdant city of Damascus because, as he is reported to have said, man is allowed to enter paradise only once. As Rabat comments, it is precisely, it seems, because Islam appeared in the desert to extend itself into the more inhabited regions of the ancient world that gardens occupy a place as important in the Islamic imaginary and the Arab-Muslim history of art. In Derrida's experience and thought, the conjured, implored, sworn with, warded off green has a fraternal or maternal twin, as it were, the closest of the close, but therefore forbidden language, Arabic, which is, of course, the language of the Quran. In his conversation with Mustafa Sherif at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris in spring 2003, really moments after learning of the diagnosis that would take his life 15 months later, Derrida reminisced on his childhood and youth in his native Algeria. That is, on his lived experience as an Algerian, vécu d'Algérien, or more precisely, as a French Maghreban Jew, or maybe simply as an, quote, Arab Jew. Let me quote extensively, that's quote number 2. I want to speak here today as an Algerian who became French at a given moment, lost his French citizenship, then recovered it. Of all the cultural wealth I have received, that I have inherited, my Algerian culture has sustained me the most. This is what I wanted to say as a testimony from the heart. Everything that has interested me for a long time regarding writing, the trace, the deconstruction of Western metaphysics had to have come out of a reference to an elsewhere whose place and language were unknown or forbidden to me. The Arab language, that other, was unknown or forbidden to me by the established order. A ban was placed on the Arab language. The ban came out of an educational system, as we say in France. Given the colonial censors and the social barriers, the various forms of racism, given the disappearance of Arabic as a daily, official, and administrative language, since it was replaced by the colonizers' French, the only way to learn Arabic was at school, but as a foreign language, as that strange sort of foreign language that is the language of the other, although, and this is what is strange and disturbing, of another who was the closest of the close. For me, Arabic was the language of the neighbor, because I lived on the edge of an Arab neighborhood on one of those borders that were both invisible and almost uncrossable. Segregation was as effective as it was subtle. Before I disappeared into high school, there were still young Algerians, close and infinitely far away. That was the distance that was inculcated into us, if I may say so, by experience, unforgettable and universal. The optional study of Arabic was still, of course, allowed. We knew it was permitted. That is, everything except encouraged. The administration offered it in the same capacity and in the same form as a study of any other foreign language in all the French high schools in Algeria. Arabic, an optional foreign language in Algeria. The language taken away from us, no doubt, became the most foreign. Sometimes I wonder whether this language, unknown for me, is not my favorite language, the first of my preferred languages, and like each of my favorite languages, because I admit to having more than one, I like to hear it above all outside of any communication in the poetic solemnity of song or prayer. Given the description which I quoted above of green itself in Un ver à soie, to whose phonetic translation as a silkworm and one's own worm, I now would like to add a silken green and one's own green, un ver à soie, one might transcribe this testimony as follows. The green taken away from us no doubt became the most foreign. Sometimes I wonder whether this green, unknown for me, is not my favorite color, the first of my preferred colors. This preferred color brings me to glas. If animals, as Michael Marder writes, have suffered marginalization throughout the history of Western thought, then non-human, non-animal living beings, such as plants, have populated the margin of the margin, the zone of absolute obscurity, undetectable on the radars of our conceptualities. Jeffrey Nealon points out that after the posthumous publication of The Animal That Therefore I Am in 2006, Derrida has become a linchpin figure in the field of animal studies. But already in 1974, plants populate the margin of the margin in Derrida's glas, both in form and content, and from there entangle with their colors and their green the philosophical concepts, especially Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's, from all directions, including, and this is crucial, from within. It is, of course, not by chance that Derrida in this book pits ontology against ontology, the doctrine of being against a collection of flowers. In addition, the imperceptible phonetic difference in French between ontologie and ontology, anthology and hauntology complicates the stakes. Indeed, in glas, flowers haunt the texts. The flowers that grow in and out of the column on Jean Genet overshadow and haunt the column on Hegel. As Claudine Sartilio, one of the early commentators on Glas, remarks, the flowers in Glas are all funerary flowers. But again, crucially for a deconstructive approach, they don't only invade the Hegel column from the outside, that is from the Genet column, rather they grow in and out of the Hegel column as well. One reason why the concept ecology appears in the 2015 volume Jacques Derrida, Key Concepts, is that Derrida's writing is deeply ecological in the sense that from the start it problematized the originary violence of metaphysics inherent in and inseparable from the setting, sentencing, postulating, imposing, setzen in German, of strict oppositions. Setzen, as you know, is a very Hegelian word. In Derrida's close reading, texts unfold by increasing rather than decreasing their strangeness. And that's really the case with Glas, big time. As Timothy Morton observes, ecological beings at whatever scale are uncanny. That is, they are what they are, yet not exactly what they are, whichever way you look. They exemplify what Derrida calls the arrivant, an arrival. He is thinking of the future that cannot be predicted in advance, yet is not just anything at all or nothing. Morton's own term for the arrivant is strange, stranger. He explains a badger, a flock of starlings, a bee swarm, or an antelope are all strange strangers. They are strange even to themselves, and their strangeness is irreducible, such that the more we know about them, the more strange they become. This is exactly what happens when one reads the botanical pages in Glas. The further one gets along, the uncannier, stranger, unworldlier the flowers appear. Their organs, or actually they don't have organs, but their modules, lamillas, stamen, styluses, pistils, corollas, etc., might as well be those of extraterrestrials. In 2017, Emanuele Coccia bemoaned in his book, La vie des plantes, that at this point it is completely normal for someone who calls him or herself a philosopher to know the most insignificant events of his or her nation's historical past, all the while ignoring the names, lives, and histories of the animal and vegetal species that provide his or her daily nourishment. Coccia describes the rise of specialization in the university system as based on a mechanism of reciprocal ignorance. To be a specialist does not mean to know more about a given subject, but rather to have obeyed a juridical obligation to ignore other disciplines. Derrida's Glas flouts this obligation. Indeed, Glas contains a wealth of detailed biological, specifically botanical information. For example, towards the end of the text, which leads back to the beginning, belying those very terms in favor of a loop, 3-page-long columns on Genet provide descriptions on the intricacies of stamen morphology and functions in different flowers. On the non-botanist reader, the effect of the staggering multiplicity of ways to produce and propagate seeds is nothing short of dizzying. In other words, to quote Sartilio again, the botanical model of the flower links deconstruction and dissemination in the sense that neither opposes signification or production of meaning, but proposes an extravagant reading which reveals the writing process as providing an excess of syntax over semantics, a waste, a squandering of seeds and seams, out of which meaning is eventually gathered. In his 2016 book, Plant Theory, Jeffrey Nealon has proposed an extraordinarily productive reading of Glas. that I really recommend to anybody interested in GLA. And I will quote from this book extensively in the following. The linchpin of inquiry in GLA, Neelan emphasizes, is the plant, not the animal, Neelan continues, which Derrida demonstrates time and again is already incorporated into the movement of spirit by Hegel. The animal is. So animal may in fact be said to be the ground of that movement of desire in Hegel. Hegel's animal desire is the engine of the dialectical discourse, whereas the plant desire, endlessly on display in the Genet column in GLA, doesn't lead anywhere or anywhere proper. Masturbation, queer desire, prison, the thief's underworld, cathextion onto the mother, can any of these be raised in the sense of sublated, aufgehoben, like a flower and connected centrally to the erections that populate Genet's text, like flowers, this other desire emerges intensely and lingers for a moment before it releases its seed to the wind, and it's gone. So no Hegelian result, in other words. It is crucial to recall, as Neelan reminds the reader, that Derrida's work on animality is not offered in the name of lifting up the animal, suggesting the animal is similar to the human in sensation, suffering, death, relation to world, etc., but rather wonders whether all the things that Western thinking has said about the animal, it behaves rather than acts, it has no access to entities as such, it has no knowledge of finitude, all those things are finally all that can be said about humans as well. According to Neelan, this is also the gambit and logic of Derrida's obsession with plants in GLA. Quote, are humans ever lifted to the level of being for themselves, giving themselves their own place, the impossibility of which Hegel states is a major difference between plants and animals? Or are humans somehow akin to plants, at the end of the day subject wholly to their environments, living, growing without entelechy and dying indifferently, responding as they can to the events that happen around them, events or emergencies within a physical world largely indifferent to any particular life form as such? What the mise en scène that is GLA demonstrates is that animality remains a biocentric concept in a very specific understanding of life, namely one that privileges singular entities because they alone in Western thinking, including Heidegger and Derrida, as Neelan shows, can have a unique relation to futurity or to the each time unique phantasm about infinitude that is the world. So in Derrida, this unique relation to the world defines what is alive. By contrast, in GLA, plant life functions as an intense figure of this distributed, violent power of emergence on which everything depends. Neelan shows that as an intense eruption of physis, the plant as such is not technically alive in Derrida. It has no phantasmatic world or singularity, but it is the condition of impossibility for life. Derrida, this is a quote, Derrida never ceases to offer us iterative names for these inescapably temporal conditions of emergence that guarantee only one thing: the impossibility of transcendent, atemporal, full presence. Plants are a conceptual figure in Derrida for the power of emergence, but they are not emergence itself, as emergence is not something that can be captured by definition. Such emergence is each time unique, the beginning of what may or may not become a world. While vegetable life is not the only name for emergence itself, any more than différence with an A, the trace, or any of the other names Derrida offers, plant life, according to Nealon, remains an intense and provocative instance of emergence. And such vegetable physis is compelling among those other names, precisely insofar as plant life is familiar to us, ordinary in the best sense. But vegetable life, nonetheless, remains blocked in interesting and productive ways from an easy analogy or correlation to the human and or animal life trajectory of world and relation, end of quote. Plant life is familiar to us, ordinary in the best sense. We completely take the plants that surround us for granted, in most cases without knowing anything about them, no names, nothing. And we hardly acknowledge that without them, we would not take a single breath. The metaphysical snobbery that defines our culture, as Emanuele Coccia puts it, one cannot separate let me start over. The metaphysical snobbery that defines our culture, notwithstanding, as Emanuele Coccia puts it, one cannot separate the plant, neither physically nor metaphysically, from the world that accommodates it and which it accommodates. Plants are the most intense, radical, and paradigmatic form of being in the world. To interrogate plants means to understand what it means to be in the world. The life of plants, Coccia continues, is a cosmogony in action, the constant genesis of our cosmos, because it is through them and with their help that our planet produces its atmosphere and makes breath possible for the beings that cover its outer skin. Mimicking such cosmogony in action, or to quote Charles Darwin's quite pre-Derridian concept, such cosmogony in circumnutation, Gla, as Nealon observes, moves like a plant or a vine by agglutinating rather than demonstrating, by cross-pollinating, becoming invasive, coiling, and above all by what Derrida calls vegetable grafting or cutting of one text and hybridizing it with another. Otherwise put, like plants, Gla develops in a modular rather than unitary way. Its growth and movement suspend hierarchical topologies such as inside and outside, beginning, middle, and end, and by extension, oppositions such as male and female, original and quote. As Coccia underlines, in making possible the world of which they are both part and content, plants destroy the topological hierarchy that seems to reign over our cosmos. They demonstrate that life is a rupture in the asymmetry between container and contained. When there is life, the container is located in the contained and is thus contained by it, and vice versa. Breath is such a contained that is also a container. Again, Coccia, to breathe means to be immersed in a medium that penetrates us with the same intensity as we penetrate it. And of course, yesterday, Anthi Georgiadi showed this powerfully in her reading of Red Dust. Indeed, glass layout and typeface morph into an application of vegetal life. Plants' bodies are constructed on a modular design in which each part is important, but none is truly indispensable. That is, plants' functions are not related to organs, which prevents a so-called unitary organization. Glas resembles a modular organism, and this modularity animates the quasi-categorical statement on one of its first pages, and that's quote number 3. I read the English, you can read the French. Practical deconstruction of the transcendental effect is at work in the structure of the flower, as of every part, in as much as it appears or grows as such. Glas is also an enormous and invasively green mise-en-scène of the demonstrations provided in earlier texts, such as La Dissémination and White Mythology, which analyzed how flowers are assigned a special role by philosophers who try to stabilize the primacy of the spoken word over the written word, and of all the other evaluative oppositions that are the hallmark of philosophy. Plato's Phaedros is here, of course, paradigmatic. As Derrida demonstrates in his famous reading of Plato, a striking pattern dominates all of Western philosophy, according to which good writing, natural living, knowledgeable, intelligible, internal speaking, is opposed to bad writing, a moribund, ignorant, external, mute artifice for the senses. But the twist highlighted by Derrida is that the good one can be designated only through the metaphor of the bad one. Metaphors are flowers of discourse, rhetorical flowers. This old Platonic paradigm is revived in Rousseau and Hegel, among others. Rousseau, for example, I quote, as man's first motives for speaking were of the passions, his first expressions were tropes. Figurative language was the first to be born. Proper meaning was discovered last. And Derrida comments on these passages extensively. And Rousseau, quoted by Derrida, adds, it is the genius of Oriental languages to be vital, vive, and figurative. Oriental languages, thus, are particularly flowery, an assertion found in Hegel's Aesthetics as well, also quoted in Glas. I quote Hegel through Glas. The Greek philosophers' plastic severity and solidity does not tolerate the sort of blending involved in metaphor or permit them to stray hither and thither away from the homogeneous material and the simple, self-contained, complete cast in order to gather up so-called flowers of expression here and there, sogenannte Blumen des Ausdrucks aufzulesen. Metaphor, Hegel continues, is, quote, always an interruption of the course of ideas. On the other hand, it is particularly the East, the later Mohammedan poetry, which uses figurative expressions and indeed has them of necessity. For Hegel, to what he calls Mohammedan poetry, the flowers are not accidental, but of necessity. As I will show in a moment, Hegel pushes this argument a troubling but not surprising step further. Glas continues by quoting Hegel's reflections on plants and their colors, which the latter gleaned from Goethe. While the plant is described as pure relation to the outside, exteriorizing itself from itself to follow the light, the sun, and thus, according to Hegel, having no self, the flower is seen as a dialectical step forward by setting, quote, free an advance in the movement of reappropriation and subjectivization. In an aggressively anti-Newtonian argument, Hegel sees in the flower's blossom a moment of Aufhebung, a moment of relief, of sublation. The light no longer comes to provoke or tear out from outside. On the contrary, the light engenders itself spontaneously from inside the plant. The color of the flower manifests this phenomenal auto-determination of the plant. Consequently, the plant now engenders, gebiert, gives birth to, like a mother, the light from itself as its own self. It does this in the flower, in which the neutral color green is from the outset determined as a specific color. The plant, from being a heliotrope following the sun, becomes for Hegel a heliotroph, nourishing the sun from within. As always in Hegel, the exterior has to be interiorized in order to appropriate the other and turn it into one's own and proper. In the middle of the consideration on plants' relation to light, Hegel drops a sentence that at first sight appears strangely unrelated. And Julian, this is quote number 4. Der Mensch bildet das Selbst mehr in sich hinein. Der südliche Mensch kommt aber auch nicht dazu, sein Selbst, seine Freiheit objektiv zu gewahren. Man forms the self more into himself. I'm sure my translation is very unelegant, but it's literal. But the southern man, or the southern human being, does not succeed in keeping or realizing, one could also literally translate, truing his self, his freedom objectively. In other words, the southern man, that is the one who, as we just learned, not only relishes in metaphors, but whose language needs them of necessity. The southern man, the one kissed by the sun and thus himself a heliotrope, ends up not being able to generate light from within and is therefore like a plant without a flower, just green. Should we say a Muslim? We could, of course, also say a Jew, an African, or to quote Derrida's self-portrait as a child in circumfession, un petit juif noir et très arabe. The child in the sun-drenched summer of El Biar, himself perhaps a creature resembling a heliotrope in search of the light-filled green of the mulberry leaves, had the right intuition. While he conjured the green of the mulberry tree, everyone in the family warded it off. And certainly a whole history and a whole war of religions did. Toute une histoire et toute une guerre des religions. Warding off green, warding off the flowers that emerge out of green, warding off plants, as Glass shows, was part of this whole history and this whole war, and a whole philosophy as well. Derrida's summary of his 1971 essay couldn't be more poignant, and that's the last quote. Metaphysics, the White Mythology, so this is from 1971, Metaphysics, the White Mythology with reassembles and reflects the color of the West. The white man takes his own mythology, Indo-European mythology, his own logos, that is the mythos of his idiom, for the universal form of that he must still wish to call reason, which does not go uncontested. The original is ce qui ne va pas sans guerre. So Alan Bass really, I think, should have translated, which does not go without war. And actually, I would say without endless wars. I will conclude, I will be done in 2 minutes now. I will conclude by moving from Europe and North Africa to this continent, to very briefly mention a specific legacy of one of these wars, a legacy that is just beginning to be recognized more broadly in the United States through the so-called land acknowledgements of US universities. Like so many others, the university where I work, UC Santa Barbara, is located on land stolen from indigenous peoples. Like all the Indian tribes on the North American continent, the Southern California Chumash had an intensive relationship to all beings around them, all encountered as spirit beings, animals, stones, weather, the sky, plants, fire. When in 1888, the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Oberle, wrote that in order for assimilation of American Indians to succeed, I quote, "The Indian must be removed from the degrading communism of the reservation and must be imbued," and all this are quotes, "and must be imbued with the exulting egotism of American civilization so that he will say, I, instead of we, and this is mine, instead of this is ours." Oberle praised the General Allotment Act passed by the US Congress in 1887, a law which broke up communally owned reservation land in order to assign individual allotments to Native families, which was a concept completely unknown to them. Before the degrading communism of the reservation, however, that very communism had been an interspecies one, which intensely included plants, animals, mountains, weather, fire. One could call it a green communism that included indigenous eco-cultural fire processes, which acknowledged the interrelated and the interdependent aspects of fire that follow the laws of the land and of the land's inhabitants. Meaning plants, animals, stones, the weather, and fire. Within decades of settler colonization, the indigenous fire regime was extinguished along with the natives, with the consequence that the old fire regime of the indigenous communities yielded to a fire rush. Today in California, and I'm sure in Arizona, in front of whose flag I am standing, fire season, so the saying goes, lasts 13 months. This is not a figure of speech. The endless war against indigenous peoples yielded to an endless war against fire. Understanding very late in the game that the latter is futile and doomed, some California fire departments have begun to revive violently eradicated indigenous fire and vegetational practices, which for centuries had kept fires not only manageable, but productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful, rich talk. It was really amazing. Lynn, you'd like to start off the questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was absolutely extraordinary. I want to go back to your opening quotations from A Silkworm of One's Own. And I'm just wondering, so I read that scene, I'm trying to use it with students, it's almost impossible, but it kind of sounds like crazy talk, but it makes me think that Derrida is almost purposefully restaging the primal scene. That this is a primal scene with the shoebox, with the mulberry leaves and the silkworms, and this interweaving of the child's curious gaze to this box is a primal scene without shame, but with curiosity and with cultivation. And I just want to proffer that as a thought. And somehow this is linked to that essay being published in Wales next to Savoir, and Derrida's own invocation that we read Savoir aloud and we listen to all those V's. And he, because he remarks on the labial consonants of the V's, which are so magnified in the passage that you address, the ver, the verdure, all of this. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I mean, I only focus on a very, very small portion at the very end of the text. So, of course, this very end of the text is preceded by many reflections on what indeed I think could be read as a primal scene, or a number of primal scenes actually. And yes, the connection to Hélène Cixous's text is crucial, and all that, of course, I did not take into consideration, but I guess I was just so happy to find Le Weber Conjuring that I jumped upon it and forgot all the rest.
Somebody has said this, it was Christopher Griffin. He's in the UK. He says, this is an extraordinary presentation. I already feel the need to watch it again. Just thanks, Chris. Gil.
I also want to say thank you. It was amazing, and eye-ear opening in all kinds of ways. So I'm not sure I can make sense. One small thing I wanted to ask is there's a Shabbat in the quote from the Sekorum of One Zone, and I just was wondering what you make of that. But it's a minor issue. I wonder about the theory of color. There's something about the plants that is also about plants and flowers that is a proliferation of color. And so I'm wondering what happens when green becomes dominant. And on one hand, I really, really obviously like what you did with the green in Islamic texts, in the Quran, etc. But I'm just wondering about what happens to that color. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's the same question, but one of the things that was strange to me in Kochia is the almost total absence, right, with the emphasis on air, mm-hmm. right, and the relation between plants and air. There's an almost total absence of the question of nourishment, right? So yeah. The plant produces air, lives in the air, right? So astrology, but there's almost nothing about nourishment. There's mm-hmm. almost nothing about water. And that's just gonna be perverse, but I'll just add one thing, which is about what happens, particularly with the way you ended, which was both very important and also multifarious, right? Fire, stones. The books about mushrooms these days and fungi mm-hmm. have introduced a whole new dimension of the between the mineral and the vegetal, right. And so there's something perhaps about the reduction to the green and the reduction to the plant, as vast and as necessary as it is. So I don't want to take anything away from the beauty of everything that you've done and the thoughtfulness of everything you've done. But I'm just wondering, so sorry, it's there was so much that.
So the Shabbat of colors, indeed, I've asked myself what this is about, because this ending of Envers Soi, it's really the ending of a text on his talit, which is white, and which he would put on the Shabbat, among other uses, of course. You know, I honestly don't know what he meant by that, because Derrida underlines time and again that he was not practicing. He has a nostalgia for has a certain nostalgia for the practice of Judaism. I think it is fair to say that. But at the same time, the talit plays the main role in this entire text. And given that it's very white, I skipped over it here, so forgive me. But yeah, it has intrigued me, and I share your being intrigued. Even though perhaps someone else has ideas on that, who is more familiar with the practices of Shabbat than I am. As for Kochia, yes, actually, one of the few quotes I took from this book mentioned nourishment, but it's true that it's very, very rare. He focuses on air. And I think for him, the main reason is that at some point, the Western philosophical tradition decided to go for psyche rather than pneuma. And so what he does in this book is, I mean, this is now my speculation, it is almost Nietzschean re-evaluation of values. You know, can you have psyche without pneuma? And the answer is, of course, a resounding no. So, but yeah, I mean, Courtier's book has flaws, but what I really loved about it is how irreverent it is. It's not intimidated by you know, these big, I mean, he just points out there are no plants in Western philosophy, and he's awfully right. So he takes it from there, but yeah. But the more important question you asked, what about the other colors? I haven't gotten there yet. I'm sure it will be exciting, but yeah, there too, I need to see what happens.
Thanks.
And thank you for this amazing mind-expanding talk. Just the kind of naive question. On the one hand, I'm very moved by the idea of rethinking the human or rendering the human ecstatic by virtue of this disclosure of kind of being with plants. But on the other hand, it's obviously the case that not every relationship to a plant affords that sort of ontological or ethical possibility, that there are manners of relating to plants that are profoundly instrumental. Mm-hmm. But what does it mean to instrumentalize a plant? I mean, it seems to me maybe it's not that it wouldn't necessarily take the same form as instrumentalizing an animal, for example. And I'll just conclude with you know, reading socialist kind of either you call it utopian thinking or planning for surviving in an era of climate change. Two proposals. One is rewilding the earth, half-earth socialism. Another is global veganism, which is obviously going to require something like another green revolution, rationalizing agriculture on a global scale in ways that I find both profoundly attractive but also frightening, maybe because it still puts us in a position of mastery, but what does it mean to master a plant? I don't know. If you could talk about the ethics of being with plants, if that's a fair question. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, one big focus in Derrida's Glas is on Hegel's discourse of the sacrifice. So for Hegel, sacrifice starts with the animal. And so you can't sacrifice a plant. I mean, there are many reasons for that, and for Hegel, of course, sacrifice is necessary. It's, you know, that's how the spirit moves. By the way, you have to face death in order to, you know, all this. So what is so intriguing about plants is, for many plants, you can actually, let's say, harvest or pick 90%, and the plant will still survive, right? So the whole question of killing a plant or eating a plant, I mean, that is what, you know, that is because it has a modular structure. And yes, of course, I think the questions you raise, namely of massive industrial agriculture, I mean, those questions are massive, and as you know, we will have to face them, and they will require, in order to somehow, they will require a fundamental rethinking of our relationship to plants. And of course, there are many different varieties of relating to plants, but one could perhaps say, well, let's start relating to them.
Thank you. You have something.
Hi, thank you for this extraordinary, beautiful talk. I also like Kocha's text very much. I think this is very problematic, and I like it in some ways. And I like what you said, that it resonates Nietzsche and the revaluation of values. I also think it's a very Heideggerian, Benjaminian text. And it brings to philosophy what Stefano Mancuso says about the turn to plants and a Copernican revolution. I wanted to talk about the color green and follow up from what from Gilles' question about nourishment, because green, the color green, is a metabolic product. Is that wavelength that is not assimilated by the plant. So we could say it's a metabolic waste. It's something that is rejected by the plant, or it's unassimilable. And I was wondering whether you could link that to what you said about gland and the vomit as what opens a space of possibility.
I'm glad that you mentioned the biological, botanical fact of green as a metabolic product. So, I think people like Mancuso, but also Kochia in his own, Kochia wrote this book, yes, because he went actually to a high school, an agricultural high school. So he knows plants really well. I'm sure we could ask him plenty about nourishment, about, so two things that I want to underline. Nourishment would be a non-sacrificial one because the plant can survive it. I mean, under certain conditions, of course. But I'm not sure that I can link it there on the spot to the vomit. I mean, I use it, of course, as something that is rejected, warded off, right, excluded, even though it's, and in the sense of plants, they literally opened the space of possibility. I could have insisted on that quote much more, because they opened the atmosphere, right? And yes, perhaps one more remark to the previous contributor. When I say plants, this is, of course, this is not exclusive of all these life forms that are in between, or that are plants, but also are other things such as algae and mushrooms. I find it very interesting that the humanities have really started to become very attentive to these life forms and see and acknowledge their intensely collaborative aspects, right? Plants are not isolated from each other, as you all by now know. I'm sure those books have made the rounds. And so this kind of intensely working together is very fascinating in all these plant forms. I don't know whether I replied to your question really, but.
We have another question from Mina.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth. This was a very moving talk. And it's more of a comment, what I really appreciated is the way you related that semiotic access of the flower in non-Western, particularly Arabic languages, as you mentioned, to the way these others, these Southern men, are disavowed or objected as impossible participants in this wonderful metaphysics of snobbery, and even more so in democratic projects. And because you opened up with this last conversation that Derrida had with Sharif, in which he returns to this idea of the possibility of thinking of an Arabic democracy.
Right.
You made me think, and you ended, of course, with a gesture to the Native American, which conjures, whose history conjures a lot of other concurrent histories of the indigenous populations across the world right now, who are being deprived of their stones and their plants and their creeks and their fogs, not only as sites of spirituality, but as sites of real community building, sites where they can pursue building of the community poetics that generates other forms of democratic practice, much necessary for them to survive neoliberal capitalism, but much necessary for them also to find ways of resisting it.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if I followed you correctly, but I really enjoyed the way you built that nuanced association. And thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I when you, I've only started very recently to look at these texts, but in epistemologies of the South, this is, the relationality between human beings and other beings, other earth beings. It's a given, and it's something that has been done for thousands of years, right? So, of course, I do not know whether, when California firefighters now say, well, we better start getting wisdom from peoples who have dealt with fire for so long. It is really, as you know, it's not at all certain that it's not way too late for that. But I found it just very, very symptomatic that in California there is this, there's a shift. It's a massive shift, actually.
Okay, there's another question online which I am to read out. Thank you for this wonderful, it's by Natalie Lazinskiewicz at ASU. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. In the many approaches to ecological thoughts, there sometimes appears an interesting tension between plants and animal, or rather animals and other strangers, mushroom, bacteria, stones, etc. At times there seems to be an idolization of a broader thinking of life beyond experience and individual being, and therefore beyond questions of suffering and individual ethics. On the one hand, this seems very important. On the other hand, I worry about what happens when we lose sight of what Brecht called solidarity with torturable bodies. Do you have any thoughts on how to hold both these strands together?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, this is extremely important, but I really have to say, if one knows a little bit of Native Americans, one knows that those bodies have been tortured for centuries. So I really do not, I would regret it very much if one understood such an approach to be exclusive of considering, to quote Brecht, to quote this question, torturable bodies, because you cannot. I really think, I mean, I haven't really, in this text, in my presentation, perhaps, I focused on plants and flowers and all that, but the torturable bodies, I mean, since you mentioned them, the United States very recently, and actually still does, tortures Muslim bodies, right? So, I mean, I know now I'm jumping all over the place, but I do really not think that one has to make a choice, because that endless war against native communities, that is something that is, in my opinion, in this country, not at all collectively and societally acknowledged. It's a genocide that has never been really faced. So, speaking of tortural bodies, yeah, anyway, I will repeat myself here, but I really would hope that such an approach would not be severed from from bodies bodies in the more common sense. Anyway, I know that my question is, my answer is a little messed up, but I'd plead not to make that separation.
We have one more question, I think.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly moving on many, many levels. Early in your talk, when you were speaking about the different iterations of vert, verdure, etc., the one line that I was surprised not to hear was le vert et où, the gloss in a signature event context, where Derrida glosses at Husserl, if I'm not mistaken, which led me to think about language and plants. And then I was reminded of Barbara Cassin's reading, I think of the Gorgias, where she argues that the distinguishing factor between the Athenian and the other, the non-citizen, was distinguished by language. And I remember distinctly hearing her lecture, and she says, if you cannot speak, you are a plant. And this becomes this trope that's repeated over and over. So I have a question about language. And then the last thing that led me to was a recent development, which I'm sure we all also know about, which is the designation of plants and natural bodies as persons, particularly in Central and South America, which is a pretty ironic thing to do, considering in this country we designated corporations as people. So maybe those are the bad people, and then the good people are the lakes and the streams and so on. So I guess my question has to do with whether or not having language is a problem for plants. Is it a good thing to consider them as humans? Does this just obliterate the distinguishing difference that you've spent an hour developing so beautifully? Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, there are lots of plant biologists who say, yes, of course, plants don't have human language, but they have their own language. They have plenty of ways to communicate. They communicate with insects, they communicate with moss, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, we, you know, I wouldn't say, of course, that they have language as we do, but for example, Stefano Mancuso, in this brilliant book, it's called Brilliant Green. It's really a wonderful book. He enumerates all the senses plants have, and they have something like 15 more senses than we do. So he basically says, just stop thinking of plants not being responsive, not being active, not being, you know, because they take all kinds of initiatives. So, and at the same time, you know, this is very, very living research. I mean, they discover more and more things. What was your second point? I'm sorry, I'm blanking here.
Plant personhood.
Oh yeah, plant personhood. That's a very interesting question, and yet there is a book, it's called Plants as Persons, and it lists all these different traditions in which plants were considered persons and in which sense. And I'm tempted to say, why? Why? Let's not return to those old concepts, which clearly, I mean, I'm not saying one should throw them away, but you know, let's try perhaps other ways of thinking, being together, interacting. Yeah, yeah, so, I'm not particularly invested in, I think it would be a missed opportunity to rush to personhood. But, perhaps other people see this differently. I'm not that invested in personhood, but at the same time, I should add, there are, of course, very important questions with regards to human rights. So I don't want to jeopardize the concept of personhood either. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thank you so much for
There's-
such a wonderful.
I think there's
there's
still
another
one
more.
one more.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. It was very thought-provoking. This question is not very well formulated yet, but I'm wondering if you've thought about putting into conversation how you're thinking about green and plants and the relationship to indigenous peoples with the other histories of green, and specifically I'm thinking of Nazism and green, sort of the green movements that were attached to fascist ideologies and blood and soil and the sort of obviously very different histories and politics. But I think part of what's interesting is the question of how do you know or identify the political questions that then that we may think we know only because of how the consequences manifest after it's too late in some respects to, I don't know exactly how to say that part of it, but do you get what I mean? Sort of I'm curious if you're thinking at all about how you're thinking about green and plants into conversation with some very different histories and politics.
Yeah, it's a very important aspect, and indeed, especially in the German history, German tradition, that is an ever-lurking danger. Absolutely. So, of course, in the German context, it's all about whiteness, about sovereignty, blood and soil, as you mentioned, of which indigenous people are by definition excluded. And by the way, all those quotes in Hegel, I mean, I'm not saying that Hegel is a precursor of National Socialism, but of course, National Socialism inscribes itself in a tradition, and Hegel is part of that tradition. So what I quoted in these snippets of texts on Mohammedan poetry, I mean, I could have quoted Hegel on the Jews, of course, which is really awful. And speaking of soil and blood, it's really awful. So yes, I'm very, very aware of that. And I also think it is very important not to, as it were, anthropologize indigeneity. I know that all this is extremely complicated. At the same time, since I live in California, and since we have now become accustomed to do these land acknowledgements, I personally think we have to fill them with something. It cannot be just enough to make a land acknowledgement and then move on. I think it is absolutely essential to spell out what the land acknowledgement acknowledges. And in the case of UC Santa Barbara, for example, we are working together with a Chumash elder to formulate the land acknowledgement, in which then is enumerated all the loss, I mean, not all, but the loss, the pain, the torture, the horrors visited upon these communities. So that is why I think there is a certain necessity, I think, but at the same time, I'm grateful for this reminder that there is indeed a whole side of ecological thought that is right wing, it's fascist. I know that there are people in the United States as well, you know, ecological green, who are in fact fascists. So yes, I think the awareness needs to be definitely present. But those people usually actually do not associate Muslims and Jews with greenness. On the contrary.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely wonderful. And